It's time for Recipe of the Day. My entire family loves spaghetti, so much so that any time I say to them, what would you like for dinner tonight? Or what would you like me to put on the meal plan for this week? All of them say spaghetti, and I get sick of spaghetti. And so I have come up with this recipe for easy, cheesy ground beef pasta that they love because it's still pasta and it's still ground beef and it still has a little bit of tomato, but it's different. It's a little creamier. It has cheddar cheese in it, so it has that flavor instead of sort of a basic, more Italian profile, like you might put Parmesan or mozzarella in there, you know what I mean? It still has the Italian seasoning, so it's still going in that direction, but it also has some Worcestershire sauce, so it's kind of like meaty and a little tangy, you know what I mean? I also find this recipe really versatile. You can add other things to it. You can add bell peppers, celery, carrots. You could wilt in some spinach or some kale. I often add a can of drained cannellini beans. So there's lots of things that you can change, and it is still so good. What does it taste like? I really think it's kind of like a grown-up from scratch or fresh version of Hamburger Helper. That is kind of where it's heading, and I love that. So it's a little retro, really comforting. I think you're going to really like this recipe. You're going to start by cooking 14 ounces of penne pasta in a big pot of salted water according to the package directions, but we're going to be scooping out some of that pasta cooking water at the very end just before draining the pasta. And so I will remind you of one of my favorite ever tips. As soon as you are reading a recipe and it says that you're going to have to remove some of that pasta water, so you're reading the recipe before you make the recipe, which is maybe even a better tip. Read the recipe first. When it says that you're going to scoop that out, even if you haven't started cooking yet, get your colander, put it in the sink, and put a measuring cup inside of it. That way, later on, when you go to drain your pasta, you will see that measuring cup and you will remember you'll put your pot back on the stove and scoop out some pasta water instead of doing what has happened to me so many times before I started doing this, where you're just draining the pasta, you pour it into the colander, and you watch it go down the drain as your brain says, oh no! So put the measuring cup in the colander, put your pasta water on to boil with the salt, cook that pasta, and while that water is heating up and while that pasta is cooking, you're going to make the sauce. A quick note about that pasta though, I'm calling for penne. You can use any pasta shape, rotini, shells, whatever you like. If you're going to use a strand pasta, linguine or spaghetti, for this recipe, I like to break them in half before cooking them just to differentiate it from the classic spaghetti dish. You know what I mean? These are shorter noodles. This is a different pasta dish. I will also say that the recipe calls for 14 ounces of pasta, but if your box is 16 ounces, you don't have to put it back into the pantry with just 2 ounces in it. Cook the whole pound, and you're just going to maybe add a little bit of extra cream at the end and a little bit of extra tomato paste when the tomato paste is added, and you might end up having to drizzle in a little bit extra of that pasta water when you're doing that step, just to make sure everything is nice and moist and creamy. So 14 ounces is ideal, but if your box has 16 ounces, you're going to be fine. Okay, while that water is heating and then that pasta is cooking, you're going to heat a large nonstick skillet over medium heat and add in your ground beef. 1.5 pounds of it. I like to use lean ground beef. You can also use ground turkey or ground chicken here. I would avoid turkey breast, ground turkey breast. That's just a little bit too dry. But you know what? I'm going to link to my recipe for how to cook ground turkey, because in there's a tip using mushrooms that you can use if you do want to use that lean ground turkey breast. Then you can do this mushroom tip and it's going to really help moisten it and bring a lot of flavor. So that is what you would do there. I will put the link in the show notes of this podcast episode for that turkey breast cooking tip. Okay, so your beef is in that skillet over medium heat and you season it with 1/2 teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of Italian seasoning. You can use store-bought, you can make your own. I will link to an Italian seasoning recipe for you, or you can use 1/2 teaspoon of dried basil and 1/2 teaspoon of dried oregano. I urge you to consider using my Italian sausage seasoning recipe, which I will also link to, or just throwing some fennel seeds in there. I swear, when you put fennel seeds in something that also has some Italian flavors, it tastes like Italian sausage, and that is never a bad thing. Okay, spread out that meat and let it cook undisturbed for a good 3 to 4 minutes till it's brown underneath. Flip it over and then start breaking it up and stirring and cooking until it's mostly cooked through. If there's any like liquid or grease or fat there that you would like to drain off, go ahead and do that. Then you're stirring in 1 medium onion chopped and 3 cloves of minced garlic. Cook and stir that until the onion is nice and soft. It's going to be about 3 or 4 minutes, and then stir in 2 tablespoons of tomato paste and 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce. Stir that well and then add in 1 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes with the juices. Stir and cook to heat that through just like a minute or two, and then stir in a half cup of heavy cream. If you don't want to use the heavy cream, that is fine. There are other things that you can do. You can just add in some broth. It's not going to be as rich and creamy, of course, but it's going to be nice. Alternatively, half and half works well. Whole milk works well, and canned evaporated milk works well. Just remember that dairy products that have a lower fat content are more likely to curdle when they have contact with acidity, like from the tomatoes, and or when they are heated really high and like boiled. So there is tomatoes in here. You do run the risk of it curdling. The best thing you can do if you're using something other than heavy cream is to not bring it back up to a boil. So you add it in, let it warm for just a few seconds, and then start adding in the cheese and melting that in. That is what the instructions say to do for the heavy cream too, so you should be fine. I'm just cautioning you not to just kind of leave it there simmering and bubbling while you do something else. Okay, so you add in your cream, you stir and heat it through for about 30 seconds. Then you're adding in 1.5 cups of shredded cheddar cheese. Stir until that melts in. By then, you should have drained your pasta and reserved the cooking water from it. Put that pasta, after you drain it, back into the pot that it was cooked in. So often I see recipes where the pasta gets drained and then added to the pan where you're cooking the sauce. And that pan is like large. It fits all of your sauce, but it's not necessarily big enough for a full pound of cooked pasta to be stirred in there. It ends up being messy. You're trying to stir with your tongs and everything. Disaster. Instead, when you cook your pasta, cook it in a nice big pot, drain it, put it back into that pot. I will say my pot retains its heat really well and sometimes starts to dry cook the drained pasta onto the bottom of it. If yours is like that, just rinse the pot with a little bit of cool tap water for just a moment, drain that away, and then put that back on the counter on the stove, turned off, of course, and then add your drained pasta to it, and then it won't do that dried browning thing at the bottom of the pot. So you put your pasta back into that big pot that you cooked it in. Then when your sauce is ready, transfer the sauce into that big pot. You have tons of room to stir. It's going to be great. Start stirring, and then you're going to drizzle in 2 to 4 tablespoons of your reserved pasta cooking water just to make that sauce nice and silky. Taste it, add more salt and pepper if you like, and that is it. Dig in. I know you're going to like this. It is such a great alternative to the normal everyday spaghetti. My whole family loves it. I can't wait for you to try it. I will put the link to this recipe in the show notes for this podcast episode, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there, or find it in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/recipeotd. And hey, just a quick note. I'm on a recording hiatus right now, so for the next little while, I'm replaying episodes from the archives, including this one. If you heard me mention a holiday, a season, or something going on in my life that seemed a bit off, that's why. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you're enjoying these older episodes. I am Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, cookfor2.us, and from this podcast, Recipe of the Day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.